My pleasure and honor to introduce Isobel Coleman today, who is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and currently is the director of the Civil Society, Markets, and Democracy Initiative with the Council of Foreign Relations. In 2010, Isobel Coleman was designated one of the 150 women who shake the world by Newsweek magazine. And her book, Paradise Beneath Her Feet, is an important addition to our knowledge on a subject that has enormous relevance, and probably most Americans are not nearly as familiar with this as we should be. If we're talking about, if the subject is women in the Muslim world, in the Islamic world, in America we tend to get our news on topics that are alarmist and sometimes provocative. So we, for example, were told the war in Afghanistan would be justified in part because it would liberate women. In fact, Laura Bush said that the Afghanistan invasion was a fight for the rights and dignity of women. Similarly, we hear stories in the news about in Mecca in 2002 about the girls' dormitory in which that caught fire and the girls were not allowed to leave because their heads were not covered, and so many of them burned to death, others were injured. Recently, stories about Saudi women who only have just been given the right to vote and are not allowed to drive. More alarming stories about the Taliban not allowing a woman to be seen in public with anyone other than blood relation, a man, and having to wear the burqa. Palestinian mothers we read about who celebrate the martyrdom of their children who immolate themselves in mass murders. And in 2009, the story in Pakistan about the Pakistani Taliban who were caught on a video whipping a 17-year-old girl, which apparently shocked many people in Pakistan. But there's a whole side of this issue that we don't see. For example, in 1992, a Moroccan scholar named Fatima Mernissi wrote a book called Islam and Democracy, in which she pointed out that women in the Muslim world are infiltrating, this was almost 20 years ago, were infiltrating forbidden territories, notably universities, so that, for example, 25% of the faculty in universities in Pakistan are women, or were then, 28% of the faculty in Egypt, 24% of the faculty in Algeria. That's compared to 24% of the faculty in the US, and 23% in France. And 50% of all medical students in Tunisia were women at that time. But what we hear about is the fundamentalists among the Muslims, and the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, were in complicity, or acting in complicity with the government, whereas Mernissi points out that the women were struggling on their own. Now, Isobel Coleman has made an enormous contribution to this discussion with this book, and her topic focuses on Islamic feminism, the concept of working with Islam and not against it, in order to effect social change and to empower women, especially in conservative societies. She points out, for instance, that only 10% of Afghans oppose women's education. 90% of them support it, but we hear about the Taliban, who represent that 10%, and as John Esposito, the founding director of the Georgetown University Center for Muslim-Christian Relations, told me in an interview for a book years ago, if we think that the Taliban and Hamas and Al-Qaeda speak for all of Islam, it's like thinking that the Ku Klux Klan represents all of Christianity. So we need this larger corrective. So the question is, how can women's rights progress in conservative societies like Afghanistan, where religious and cultural traditions tend to oppose it? And that's where the question of Islamic feminism comes in, which, as Dr. Coleman points out, is part of the broader reform movement in the Islamic world, which is one of the great ideological struggles taking place in the world today. It's my pleasure to introduce Isobel Coleman.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Well, okay. Thank you for that nice introduction and a nice summary of my book. And as you know, the title of the book is Paradise Beneath Her Feet: How Women Are Transforming the Middle East. And as Stephen just very, I think, aptly described, you do hear a lot about the negative things. That's news. That's what sells, and we read headlines, and many of them are alarmist. You should see what they read about us. When I'm overseas and I pick up a newspaper, I'm often shocked and dismayed by the things that are picked out of our news and make headlines, and it really paints a very disturbing picture of our country. Not that those things don't occur. They do occur. But if that's all you read about our country, then you come away with quite a distorted view. I often have people concerned about my safety when I'm traveling. They are concerned about my safety because I live in New York. Is everything okay there? I read about all the unrest on the streets and the violence and the crime. It's really fine. I also have people overseas in the Middle East explain to me how, we here are quite different than you in America. You see, women say this to me. You see, we are traditional. We are somewhat conservative. You see, we love our husbands and we love our children, unlike you in America. We know that all you women are divorced and all your children are latchkey kids, but we're different than that. So it is a very, we really look at each other through, I think, quite distorted lenses. Let me step back and tell you a little bit about how I came to write this book. I am not a women's studies or a gender studies person. In fact, I never took any gender studies courses in my too long academic career. My background is in political science. I have a PhD in international relations with a focus on political economy and economic development. And at the Council on Foreign Relations, I focus on the Middle East. And as I look at the economies in the Middle East, and as I travel across the region, I keep coming back to this issue of women. Because of course we know that women and women's rights pose some very urgent human rights issues. Some of the headline-grabbing anecdotes you relayed, they happen, they are true. Women are stoned in some countries. There was the most horrific case in Somalia. A young 13-year-old girl a couple of years ago was raped. She told her parents she had been raped. They went to the authorities, and the extremists in the country buried her up to her waist and stoned her to death because she'd had sex outside of marriage. Now, I mean, these types of horrible, horrible things happen. They're not the mainstream, but they happen. In a country like Somalia that's ruled right now, parts of it by extremists, they happen with alarming frequency. But in other parts of the world, of course, things like that don't happen. But this is a very controversial subject that we're talking about, the role of women and women's rights in some of these countries. Now, so of course we have some very basic human rights issues, some very compelling moral issues, but my perspective has really been through an economic lens. When I look at the region and I look at why some economies are doing better than others, what's holding back certain societies on both an economic and a political level, you can't help but come back to this question of how countries can really prosper and succeed in the 21st century if they do not invest fully in their whole population. If they handicap themselves by only investing in half their population or giving opportunities to half their population. Now, women's rights this is not a new issue. Women's rights have been contentious throughout history and in every country around the world. They have been contentious in our own country. And if you look at the women's rights movement in the United States, you can go back to Abigail Adams writing to her husband, John, at the Constitutional Convention, please don't forget the women in all of this. And he wrote back and said, are you kidding me? And of course it was many, many decades, centuries later, until women actually got the vote in 1920 in the United States. And if you look at the American suffragists in the 19th century, many of them were labeled as being anti-family, as being anti-Christian, indeed as being communist, as somehow undermining the fabric of the society, of the nation, in their quest to get women the right to vote. Now, there's been a vibrant women's movement in various countries across the Middle East, stretching back to the late 19th century in a country like Egypt and in Iran. And yet, women's movements and women's rights activists have been smeared and have been called illegitimate in many ways by conservatives in their country, who have said that women's rights are somehow incompatible with conservative interpretations of Islam, have said that women's rights are somehow a foreign concept and inauthentic to their societies, or a Western import, that somehow they are tied up with a form of colonialism or neocolonialism. In some countries, women's rights have been conflated with many negative isms, not only Westernism and colonialism, but materialism, feminism, communism. In Afghanistan, of course, you have a strong connection between women's rights and communism, since it was one of the things that the Soviets did when they invaded Afghanistan, was say, okay, this is how it's going to be. Girls are going to go to school, and they're going to be taught by men, and we don't really care that that goes against your traditions and your customs. That's how it is going to be. In fact, today, the educated class of women in Afghanistan, in their 50s, all of the surgeons, the lawyers, the doctors, all of them were educated under the Soviets. But women's rights are very closely associated with things that have negative connotations in many people's minds. So when I look across the region, I ask the question, given this context, and given the very important urgency for greater women's rights, not only from a moral and human rights perspective, but certainly from an economic perspective, how are these changes going to happen? And as I look across the region, I see that secularism is not the most popular concept today. I'm putting it mildly. In fact, secularism is, I argue, on life support in the region. You have some secular groups and secular organizations, but as you've been seeing from the tumultuous affairs going on in Egypt and Tunisia and other countries, secularism has been imposed top-down by some very heavy-handed, hard-fisted, authoritarian rulers in the region. Even going back to the time, of course, of the great secular authoritarian leader, Kemal Ataturk. But then following in his footsteps, you had Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia. You've had in Egypt, Nasser, Sadat, Mubarak, that regime that took a very secular approach and oppressed religion, jailed religious leaders, forbid, in a country like Tunisia, women from wearing the headscarf, forbid Islamic identity, which in many ways helped encourage a flowering of Islamic revival as a way of protesting these secular authoritarian regimes. You've seen an Islamic revival going on across the region for many decades now, really going back to the 1960s and the end of the pan-Arabism that Nasser promoted, the 1967 war and Egypt's humiliation. And you've seen a rise of Islamic movements that say, look, Islam is the solution. That's the motto of the Muslim Brotherhood. And people being attracted to that, because other things have failed them. But you've also seen a growing revivalism of people both reading the Koran, attending Quranic study groups, Muslim televangelists on television, very, very popular shows. You've seen this across the region. And we're kidding ourselves if we don't understand the very, very important role that religion plays in these societies. The idea that an American candidate can get elected by saying, well, you know, I don't go to church and I don't believe in God. I mean, it's inconceivable. Our presidential candidates fall all over themselves to talk about how religious they are. And in these societies, it's similar, that religion appeals. It has enormous appeal. So the question then becomes, for women's rights, which I argue are critical for the economic and political health of these countries, how are women's rights going to happen in this environment where a conservative, a narrow interpretation of Islam does come into conflict with some basic women's rights? And I say that the answer is not necessarily secularism. In the short term, I am a secularist. I believe in secularism, meaning not atheism. That's what a lot of people mean by, interpret by secularism. That's not what I'm saying, but a separation of church or mosque and state. But that's not the reality or the possibility even in the modern Middle East as we have it today. I'm not even sure it's the reality in our country today. But it is really not the reality. And so if you say, okay, secularism is not on the horizon in the short term, even in the medium term, then what? And I say, from lots of research and travel, that the answer is a more progressive interpretation of Islam, which accommodates a modern role for women with Shariah, which is Islamic law. Now, what is Shariah? Shariah strikes fear into the heart of Americans. People think of it as people's hands being cut off for stealing and women being stoned to death. Those things are done in the name of Shariah. But Shariah is a set of laws that are derived from Islam, from the Koran, from the Hadiths, which are the sayings and doings of Muhammad. And it's a very long, large body of law that has evolved over many, many centuries. And it is interpreted very differently in different places. So you can have Al-Shabaab in Somalia saying that their version of Sharia is such that they're going to stone this 13-year-old girl to death. And in many other countries, of course, Muslim majority countries, that would never be allowed. Different interpretations. And what I see going on today is that women are playing an enormous role in influencing how the mainstream religion is interpreted and accepted. And women are playing a very big role in that because they have, in many ways, the most at stake. Because so much of the laws, I'm not talking about the criminal laws now, I'm talking about civil law. They impact people's day-to-day lives, particularly family code. Family code determines things like marriage, divorce, custody, inheritance, things that everybody experiences. And in many cases, for women, conservative interpretations of Sharia have disadvantaged women in all of these areas. And now women are pushing back and saying, look, does it have to be this way? Dress codes, as you know. Women's ability to access the public sphere. Does it have to be this way? What does the Koran really say? And actually, you brought up Fatima Mernissi. I mean, her point that more women are becoming academics is an important one, because it is many of these professors, highly educated women, like Fatima Mernissi, who are looking at this and saying, well, let's go back and look at the texts. What do they really say? Take something like polygamy. The Quran says, marry as you shall up to 4 women. Well, on that basis, polygamy is legal in many countries. But the women read it, and it says, when they look at the text, it says, but only do so if you can treat them all equally. And you know that you can't treat them equally, therefore only marry one. And the women say, why do you never read the but part? Let's read it in its entirety, and therefore make our laws such that polygamy is virtually impossible. And that is a process that has been happening. That is a tension, that is a conversation, a debate, and a process that has been happening across Muslim majority countries, where Sharia is very much part of the legal system. So in 2004, in Morocco, you saw a vibrant women's movement, which for many years had pushed, Fatima Mernissi, by the way, is Moroccan, and she was very much part of this movement, but had pushed for changes to this family code that I'm talking about, to the family law, that had such an important impact on people's day-to-day lives. And they said, you know, how is it that we can be professors at university, we can be doctors, we can be lawyers, we can be CEOs of businesses, and yet we have no rights in the family? How can that be? And they pushed for changes to the family code. They had a supportive king behind them, but they led a very grassroots movement, a signature movement, a campaign where they got 1 million signatures. And very importantly, they got religious leaders behind them who said, yes, we can read the text in a way. We'll read the but part when it comes to polygamy. And we'll also read the Koran in a different light. Take inheritance. The Koran says that that a daughter will only get 1 part, and the son will get 2 parts in inheritance. So based on that, you know, for 2 kids, the daughter will get 1/3, the son will get 2/3. Well, that strikes us as being pretty unfair. But what the women who are looking at these issues, and men, you know, some of the most important thinkers in this movement of Islamic feminism are men, by the way, very, very much so. But they'll say, okay, let's go back and look at the context. In 7th century Arabia, to give women any inheritance was radical. And in fact, it wasn't until the 20th century that women stood to inherit anything in Western countries, well into the 20th century in some countries. And so the spirit of the Quran was to give women inheritance. Now they only got 1 share and the boys got 2 because they were not heads of families. They didn't have to support their family. But today that's changed. Women do need to support their families in many cases. Therefore, they should, in the spirit of the Quran, each get an equal share. These are the types of arguments that Islamic feminists use. And they argue for these changes using religion. Religion has been used against women for so long. Now they are turning to religion to promote women's rights. And in some cases, you know, it helps bring public opinion along with them, which, as I said, in many of these countries can be very conservative. Polls show that in Egypt today, some 85% of the population believe that Shariah should be either a source or the source of law. So to just say, forget about Shariah, isn't a very workable solution, particularly now when you have democracy in Egypt, or maybe, you know, you don't have democracy today, but Tunisia, let's take Tunisia. You've just had a historic election on Saturday in Tunisia, this past weekend. And the biggest party in terms of vote was Al-Nahda, the Renaissance Party, led by Rashid Ghannouchi. It is an Islamist party, and they very firmly say, we want Sharia. We want to have Sharia as part of our legal system, our polity. Islam is our identity. And so how it is implemented is all important. And what I argue in my book is, you know, we like to talk about this clash of civilizations, a clash between the West and the Islamic world. But I don't really see it that way. What I see going on is a clash within Islam today, between progressive interpretations of Islam and more conservative interpretations. And that clash is playing out all over the world, but very deeply and urgently in countries like Afghanistan, where it's playing out very violently. As Stephen mentioned, the vast majority of people in Afghanistan support a girl's right to go to school. And yet there is a violent minority that is burning down girls' schools and throwing acid in the face of girls who are daring to walk to school and assassinating teachers as terrorist tactics, to sow fear into the population. And they've done it quite effectively. There are regions in Afghanistan today where virtually no girls go to school, or very, very small numbers. And there are other regions in Afghanistan where they have more girls in school than ever before in that country's history. Actually, overall, they have more girls in school. About 40+% of girls go to school today in Afghanistan. It's more than ever before in that country's history. And that number, I think, will only keep going up. But there are extremists who are determined to turn that back. And so you see these types of divisions playing out across the region. But you also see women playing a very active role in trying to change it. And in my book, I write about some of these very brave, courageous women. People often say to me, how did you find these women in your book? And I say, gosh, it's not hard. There are so many of them. The challenge was picking just a few to write about. When my book came out last year, there were some who were critical, saying, oh, these women are on the margins. They're never, things in the Middle East are never going to change, and women are really fundamentally oppressed, and they're never going to be leading change. And 6 months later, you had Tahrir Square, and you've seen women across the region playing such an active role. And a lot of people expressing surprise. Well, how is this? Aren't all these women shut in at home, oppressed? Who are these women out demonstrating and marching in the streets? Well, I write about this whole new generation in my book. Fatima Mernissi's generation was really a groundbreaking generation, that first post-colonial generation of women who went off, most of them educated in the West. Fatima Mernissi herself was educated in France and the United States. And a small elite. But today, you have a much, we're not talking elite, we're talking large numbers of women. One of the things that's happened has been the expansion of girls' education across the region. Today, you have a majority of college graduates in Middle East countries are women. It's a trend that's been happening around the world. It's happened in this country, it's happened in Europe, it's happening in the Middle East. And not by small numbers. In Iran today, 70% of college graduates are women. 70%. Actually, that number may have gone down recently because the clerics have been so threatened by this very, very empowered young generation of women that they've now tried to limit the number of women going to university after the Green Movement took to the streets in 2009. The clerics blamed women in many respects for that. They also blamed a liberal curriculum in the universities, and they've been working to roll that back. But in Saudi Arabia, the most conservative country in the region, 63% of college graduates are women. So you have now a highly educated generation of young women who still face many obstacles in their life. As you know, in Saudi, women can't drive. It's hard to have a career when you can't even drive yourself someplace. But there are women who are pushing into the workforce. They're very entrepreneurial. A lot of small businesses and new businesses are started by women in Saudi Arabia. You see women across the Gulf countries playing a much more active role in the business world. Some of those are daughters taking over a family business. They're now educated, and the father looks to the next generation and says, I always thought my son would take over the business, but he's kind of turned out to be a good-for-nothing, and my daughter, has all these degrees, and she's so capable, and times have changed, and she's getting the business. And you see that happening very much across the region. But you also see women starting from scratch their own businesses. You see women pushing into the political sphere. This is a part of the world that's actually, in numbers, way ahead of where we are. Tunisia used a very interesting quota system, where it wasn't a real quota system. They didn't allocate a number of seats, but they said every platform, every party list to be qualified in the election has to alternate men and women on the list. And that guaranteed a certain number of women would be elected. Not 50%, because a lot of parties only got one person off their list elected, and the top person, you're elected in the order that you're on the list, and the top person typically is a man. But for the parties that got a lot of seats, including the Islamist Al-Nahda party, and the others, roughly half, are women. And so it looks like women are going to be around 30+%. The final votes aren't in, the final tallies, I don't quite know the number, of the Tunisian parliament, versus around 17% for us here in the United States. Iraq has a quota, 25%. Afghanistan has a quota, 25%. Now, I'm not saying that these women in parliament wield enormous influence and power, but they're at the table, and that's a first step. You see change coming in other ways. Media, a huge driver of change. You've had an explosion of new media in the region, and I'm not talking about Twitter and Facebook. You've seen that, certainly. And that has been very liberating for women. You know, many of the bloggers in the Middle East are women who are able to tell their stories and get their voices heard in ways that they never could before. But I'm actually talking about some old media. You know, newspapers, old media. Newspapers are covering topics that they never did before. One of the women I write about in my book was one of the first female Saudi journalists. She became a bureau chief for a major daily. And again, you know, this new generation of women, actually from quite a conservative family in Mecca. She wears the niqab. And yet she's very determined to change things. And she writes about things that men won't write about, don't write about, in some ways can't write about because of this gender segregation that exists in society. They don't even have access to women or to be able to write about what women are doing. And so now you have in mainstream newspapers stories about subjects that people never talked about before. On television, you have talk shows. You have all sorts of different formats. You know, some of you may be familiar with the show The View here in the United States. There's a Middle East version called Sweet Talk, 4 women sitting around chatting about things that might be familiar to a viewer here of The View. Childcare, housemaking, things like that. But they also deal with some very important social issues. They bring on clerics on their show to debate. Why in one country are women allowed to do this? One Muslim country are women allowed to do this? And in this country they're not. Where in the Koran does it say that women are not allowed to drive a car? And they get clerics on the show who they force to engage on some of these subjects and talk about things like rape and incest and domestic abuse, things that have been very long taboo. 43% of viewers are men. Very interesting how it's bringing into people's living rooms different conversations that really were not even happening at all a decade ago. The most popular television show in recent years has been a Turkish soap opera called Mohammed and Noor. And you know, this has taken the region by storm. This is the type of thing that changes culture. People watch this and they ask questions. He, the lead, is a dashing, you know, successful businessman. Turkish, remember, watched by Arabs. Noor is beautiful. She works outside the home. She's his only wife. He includes her in decision-making in the family. She's successful. He's supportive of her and her career. It's a dynamic that makes people wonder, well, why is it so different? That's a Muslim country. Why is it so different in here? And debate. In fact, I think they must have felt it was so subversive that there were Saudi clerics who issued fatwas against watching this television show. Some 50+ million Arabs, nevertheless, tuned in to watch the final episode. But these are the types of things that are engaging people and that are shifting ideas and shifting culture. I'm going to wrap up. I could talk about many other things, but I know that you have some questions, and I'm happy to take any of your questions. But I will just sum up by saying, you know, I see enormous change happening. I think more Americans now see how much change is going on in the region than they did before 6 months ago. And not all the change is going to be good. You've got a lot of turmoil now. This is a very fluid environment going on, and some very bad things can emerge out of it. At the same time, you have an increasingly educated, engaged, activist generation of women across the region who are pushing from within in some quiet ways in some countries, less quiet in others, for change. And I see a lot of change happening. I see a lot of it being led by women. Thank you.